Barbed wire hummed softly in the summer wind. The sun pressed down on the rows of wooden barracks where hundreds of captured women waited behind fences they never imagined standing behind. Some were auxiliary nurses from bombed-out hospitals. Others were clerks or civilians swept into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. All shared the same fear, that the enemy they had been told to dread would now return cruelty for cruelty. Guards moved with deliberate calm, boots on dust, rifles slung but relaxed. The women watched every step, breath tight with uncertainty. Then came something completely unexpected. Metal carts rolled toward the camp square, not carrying weapons, not even rations of the usual bread or thin soup, but cold metal drums packed with ice. American soldiers lifted out small paper cups one by one, frost clinging to the edges. Ice cream. On the United States Independence Day, the enemy was being served a treat usually reserved for children and celebrations back home. Shock silenced the prisoners. Some stared, refusing to believe it. Others trembled, unsure whether to accept. The war was not yet forgotten, but in that moment, something quietly began to change. Fear is often strongest when the future is unknown. For the women who found themselves behind American wire in the final years of the Second World War, uncertainty became a daily companion. They came from every corner of the collapsing Axis sphere. Some were members of the German Red Cross, drafted into service as the Luftwaffe crumbled and field hospitals flooded with casualties. Others were communications auxiliaries, typists, and clerks of the Wehrmacht, swept into retreat and surrounded by advancing U.S. divisions. A smaller number were civilians, wives, factory workers, even teenage girls, caught up in mass surrenders as towns fell and command structures disintegrated. Many had never held a weapon, yet war did not discriminate when rounding up prisoners. The mass capitulations of spring 1945 created logistical challenges unseen in previous wars. The U.S. Army suddenly found itself responsible for not only millions of German soldiers, but also thousands of women. Decisions had to be made quickly, both for security and for humanity. Initial processing often took place in open fields and improvised enclosures. Women stood in long lines under the gaze of nervous guards, still unsure whether American uniforms meant safety or retribution. They had grown up inside a system that painted the Allies as monsters who would punish and humiliate their captives. Propaganda had deep roots, and fear traveled easily. Transport followed, trains if available, columns of trucks if not. The destinations were more permanent holding sites. Prisoner of war camps in Germany, France, Belgium, and in some cases the United States itself. There were also internment facilities for Japanese Americans on the U.S. mainland, where innocent women endured confinement under suspicion and national anxiety. Their stories, though different in origin, paralleled the same emotional reality. Identity turned into a number, freedom exchanged for fences. Arrival at American camps carried its own shock. The guard spoke in a language most women could not understand. Signs and instructions were foreign. Medical checks, delousing, and uniform distributions were performed briskly, sometimes roughly, but with a consistent order that felt strangely contradictory to expectations of cruelty. Inside the camps, daily life followed a strict rhythm. Roll calls at dawn, work details for those able and willing. Medical facilities that were functional but lacked softness. Conversations whispered at night between bunk beds. What would happen next? Would husbands or brothers be alive? Would homes still exist after so many bombings? And above all, how would the Americans treat them? Even when kindness appeared, suspicion lingered. A bowl of soup, a blanket, a gesture of patience. Was it genuine or a trap to lower defenses? Rumors spread faster than truth. One woman might recall an angry guard. Another would swear she saw a soldier smuggle an apple to a starving prisoner. Emotional balance swung between fear and cautious hope. The war's end did not immediately change this atmosphere. Germany remained occupied. Japan still fought on. Repatriation would take months, even years for some. For the women inside the camps, the calendar felt frozen, a prolonged pause between worlds where everything familiar had vanished and the future remained hidden behind barbed wire. With time, they learned the routines. They adjusted to the sound of American banter at the gates. They began to understand a few English words. Some wrote secret diaries. A few found moments of laughter again, though silently at first. Laughter could look like disloyalty. Still, the past clung tightly. Many had lost everything but their dignity, and even that seemed fragile. It is within that emotional landscape, fear slowly dissolving into reluctant trust, that a unique American tradition would intersect with the lives of these prisoners. A holiday that arrived every summer, no matter how far from home U.S. soldiers stood. A holiday that brought with it strange rituals, cheerful music, and, most surprisingly for women who expected punishment, a dessert they had not tasted in years. A single treat, cold, sweet, and unnecessary in war, soon revealed far more about the nature of captivity under the American flag than any official policy could explain. Their story now shifts from the personal to the structural to understand why that moment on July 4th was possible at all. To understand why American guards served ice cream to prisoners, including women who had worn the enemy's uniform, one must step back into the doctrines that guided the United States military during the war. The U.S. had signed and ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. Its terms required adequate food supply, medical care, humane living conditions, and protection from violence and humiliation. While compliance was not perfect, especially under the strain of millions of captives, the policy was clear: prisoners of war were not to be mistreated. Food was central to that commitment. American rations, even when reduced, often exceeded what civilians in Europe could obtain. POW meals included bread, potatoes, sometimes meat, and surprisingly, when supply chains allowed, small comforts like chocolate, coffee, or a scoop of something frozen. Ice cream was immensely popular in the U.S. military. In fact, the U.S. Armed Forces invested heavily in refrigeration technology during World War II, producing more ice cream than any nation before it. Navy ships carried ice cream machines. Army bases had chilled storage. It was a taste of home, sustaining morale on distant fronts. So when July 4th arrived each year, even in prisoner camps, commanders saw no reason to discard tradition. The day symbolized independence, democracy, the principles soldiers believed they were defending. Mess halls raised flags. Bands, if present, played music, and ice cream became a ritual, often served after the noontime meal. For the Americans, it was ordinary. For the women behind wire, it was unimaginable. But this humane treatment was not purely sentimental. It served strategic purposes. The U.S. wanted to demonstrate moral superiority over the Axis, whose prison systems, from Japanese labor camps to Nazi concentration complexes, had generated horrors that would soon become widely known. Good treatment of enemy captives protected American POWs held overseas and provided strong evidence for post-war diplomacy. The Red Cross inspected camps regularly. Generals understood that reputation could shape both battlefield surrenders and international judgment. In Europe, most female POWs were classified as non-combatant auxiliaries, which granted them additional protections. Separate facilities were created to prevent abuse and maintain order. Women often received safer work assignments. sewing, kitchen duties, maintaining infirmaries, tasks that kept both mind and body occupied. For Japanese-American internees in the U.S., the context differed. They were not enemy soldiers, but civilians removed from their homes under suspicion and fear. Their treatment ranged widely between camps, yet many experienced moments of humane relief from the monotony and injustice of confinement, including participation in American holidays. Daily routines evolved around efficiency and fairness. Housing might be Spartan, but bedding was distributed. Medical staff checked health. Pregnant prisoners received care that would not have been guaranteed in the collapsing Reich or the Pacific battlefield. Still, dignity survived only in fragments. Frictions arose with guards who carried prejudices of their own. Boredom turned into anxiety. Letters home could take months to arrive. Freedom existed only beyond fences that were always in view. Yet as months passed, the atmosphere shifted. Women saw that American discipline was strict, but not vindictive. They noticed guards who smiled or helped with translation. They realized that education classes, religious gatherings, and even recreational sports were offered not as manipulation, but because the U.S. Army believed idleness bred disorder. By the summer of 1945, many women no longer feared beatings each morning. They began lifting their heads when Americans walked by. And though victory celebrations outside the wire reminded them of everything lost, a subtle truth revealed itself. The enemy did not wish to destroy them. The enemy wished to prove itself better. This ideological clash, not between nations, but between moral standards, became visible in every ordinary act. Bread given without insult, medicine provided without demand, and ice cream, cold and sweet, handed to those who once wore the wrong uniform. Now that the foundation is set, the human fear, the American policy, the strange normalcy, the story widens into perspectives. Multiple angles reveal what captivity meant for identity, for psychology, and for justice in a world shattered by war. And from those perspectives, one can finally understand why a single holiday gesture struck so deeply. Captivity strips a person of more than freedom. It strips the familiar layers of self, one's profession, one's home, one's daily choices. For the women imprisoned in American camps, rebuilding dignity became a silent but necessary daily battle. On arrival, hair was inspected for lice. Clothing was exchanged. Numbers replaced names on rosters. Yet in contrast to the brutal dehumanization known in camps run by the SS or Imperial Japanese forces, American policies preserved a core belief: prisoners remain people. Showers, clean bedding, and regular meals brought a slow return of humanity. Women received sanitary supplies, a detail easily overlooked but vital for dignity. Medical clinics treated injuries and illness. Dental care was provided when resources allowed. A small infirmary visit, conducted without insult, reminded them of the world beyond hatred. Some camps issued standardized clothing, but others allowed prisoners to keep familiar garments if they posed no threat. That single detail, a dress, a scarf, a reminder of civilian identity, helped preserve morale. Work details brought routine. Sewing uniforms, sorting medical gear, helping in kitchens, these tasks reinforced a sense of usefulness rather than abandonment. As weeks turned into months, relationships between prisoners and guards developed within strict professional lines. A respectful nod, a shared cigarette, a guard retrieving a dropped item rather than barking an order. These gestures carried meaning far heavier than the action itself. For women who had been told that capture meant violation and humiliation, the absence of these threats was itself transformative. Slowly, They learned that dignity was not dependent on victory or defeat, but on the conduct of those holding the keys. That realization would echo in their memories long after the war ended, shaping how they told their stories, not as tales of undeserved kindness, but as proof that humanity could outlive ideology. At first, every sound was danger. A guard's footsteps could spark panic. The metallic clink of keys sounded like coming punishment. For many German and Japanese women, Allied soldiers were the imagined villains of propaganda. Cruel, vengeful, morally unrestrained. Reality challenged that image. American guards were young, many barely older than the prisoners they watched over. Some carried photographs of wives, mothers, or girlfriends tucked into helmet bands. Their smiles did not appear forced. When they joked with each other, it wasn't the laugh of tormentors. The prisoners watched and learned. Language barriers remained high walls, but gestures crossed them. A guard handing out rations with care. Doctors pausing to explain a treatment through an interpreter. The discovery that the same basketball game that made U.S. soldiers cheer could make prisoners laugh. Music was another bridge. A radio playing Glenn Miller or Bing Crosby could drift over the wire. For a few minutes, women closed their eyes and remembered ballrooms, birthdays, youth. The enemy's music sounded shockingly familiar. Suspicion did not disappear overnight. Trust grew unevenly and was often tested by individual cruelty or harsh discipline. But something undeniable formed between captor and captive: recognition. These were not monsters. They were men, frightened, bored, wanting the war to end just as desperately. When ice cream came into the camps each July 4th, the women's first reaction was often suspicion. Why offer sweetness in a world designed around survival? But year after year, those servings became symbols of a slow psychological shift. The fear of Americans turned into reluctant curiosity. Understanding did not erase the barbed wire, but it changed what the wire meant. Ice cream had once been ordinary, before rationing, bombings, and hunger. In wartime Europe and Asia, sugar shortages made desserts scarce luxuries. Refrigeration systems were destroyed. Cold sweets vanished from life. Then, in captivity, something strange reappeared: American abundance. Women stared at baseball games staged inside fences, not understanding the rules, but recognizing joy. They saw morale posters with bright colors and bold lettering. They smelled coffee, real coffee, brewed in the guard posts. American soldiers celebrated birthdays and holidays loudly. They decorated tables, played records, and cheered after meals. The contrast was overwhelming. For prisoners raised under a regime that demanded constant sacrifice, public celebration felt almost indecent. And there was ice cream, served with the same casual routine that once defined civilian life. Few prisoners took the first cup willingly. Some believed it must hide humiliation. Others feared bait, that accepting kindness might be recorded as gratitude to the enemy. Yet hunger softened resistance. First taste came with hesitation. Second taste came with memory. Sweetness triggered something painful: remembrance of a life untouched by war. A moment that did not belong to captivity or ideology. A reminder that happiness, even the smallest kind, had not been extinguished. For some women, this cultural shock brought tears, not because the treat was cold, but because it reminded them they were still alive enough to feel joy. These perspectives set the stage for deeper analysis, oversight, comparison, and testimony, revealing how such simple acts transformed the meaning of surrender. Humanity in war rarely survives by accident. The treatment these women received behind American wire was not just a reflection of individual kindness. It was monitored, measured, and judged by international eyes. The International Committee of the Red Cross inspected U.S. POW camps regularly. Inspectors examined barracks, medical facilities, food supplies, and sanitation. They recorded complaints, and commanders were expected to respond. Such oversight protected prisoners from abuses and reminded guards that their conduct reflected national honor. America's reputation mattered. Every prisoner treated fairly served as silent testimony to the principles the U.S. claimed to defend: justice, democracy, the rule of law. The war was not only fought on battlefields, it was also fought through contrasting systems. If Nazi propaganda depicted the Allies as brutal conquerors, then an American guard handing ice cream to a German auxiliary nurse became a quiet but decisive rebuttal. Additionally, proper care for POWs encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. This was particularly true in the Western European campaign, where countless German units preferred American captivity over Soviet retribution. Fair treatment of women amplified this psychological advantage. A humane reputation saved thousands of lives by making surrender a rational choice. In internal memos, U.S. officers often discuss morale, not only of their troops, but of the prisoners. Order came easier when hope existed. Food, recreation, and cultural events were not simply comforts. They were tools of stability. A prisoner who felt human was less likely to resist authority, sabotage operations, or harm herself. Thus, when Independence Day arrived and American soldiers lined up frozen treats for the enemy, it served two purposes at once: morale for the captors, dignity for the captives. Kindness became strategic. Compassion became a weapon, one that wounded no one. To understand the effect of American generosity, one must look at what many prisoners had escaped the brutal systems of their own side. Women who had seen the inside of Nazi camps witnessed cruelty normalized to efficiency. Jewish prisoners were reduced to numbers inked on skin. Political dissidents disappeared without trace. Hunger, beating, and disease were not accidents, they were policy. Many German women knew these details firsthand, if not through personal experience, then through rumors and the uneasy silence that surrounded such places. Japanese camps across Asia carried different ideology but delivered similar suffering. Captured Allied women, nurses, and missionaries endured forced marches, starvation, and violence. The Imperial Japanese military viewed surrender as dishonor, making captives something less than human in their eyes. When women who had lived under these regimes entered American hands, they noticed something disturbing. The enemy treated them better than their own government treated many of its own citizens, or victims. This realization created cognitive dissonance. Could the people they were taught to hate actually hold stronger moral ground? Could propaganda truly have been wrong? Such questions were dangerous, yet impossible to ignore when faced with proof. In the quiet hours of captivity, behind fences that no longer felt threatening, many women confronted the uncomfortable truth. They had supported systems that offered no mercy, yet they were now receiving it. That contrast would shape how they remembered the war for the rest of their lives. Long after the guns fell silent, memories of imprisonment remained vivid. Not the bars or the roll calls, but the unexpected gestures. Women who later wrote memoirs or gave interviews often described the July 4th ice cream with lingering astonishment. One former German auxiliary recalled that the freezing sweetness made her hand shake, not from cold, but from disbelief that life could still hold pleasure. Another remembered that the guard handing her the cup avoided eye contact, as though embarrassed by kindness in a place built for punishment. A Japanese-American internee, reflecting decades later, said that July celebrations reminded her of the freedom she was denied, but also of the country she hoped would claim her again without suspicion. Many said the treat tasted of childhood, of warmth before war, of a world where fear did not dictate appetite. Some women refused it, a silent act of loyalty to a defeated nation. But even they remembered the moment vividly. The offer itself, not the acceptance, was what mattered. In those recollections, the theme remained constant. When everything is taken away, humanity is measured in the smallest gifts. These testimonies ensure that such gestures, simple, quiet, easily forgotten by those who gave them, are remembered as turning points in the hearts of those who receive them. With these angles explored, human, psychological, strategic, comparative, and personal, the stage is set for the decisive moment. A moment when the war did not end, but mercy asserted itself against decades of hatred. The year 1945 arrived differently depending on which side of the fence one stood. For America's soldiers in Europe, it marked victory, homeward orders, and celebrations long delayed by years of combat. For the women behind those same fences, it marked survival, but not yet freedom. June warmed into July. Word spread quietly. Independence Day was coming. Prisoners had learned what that meant. More music, more smiles, and something frozen. Carts rolled out from the kitchens of camps scattered across the Allied-occupied zones, from Germany and Italy to England and the American Midwest. Chalkboard signs appeared near mess halls. Guards joked with each other about the big day. Radios played upbeat tunes, carried across fences to ears that still flinched at sudden noises. Inside the women's barracks, a tension formed that was neither fear nor excitement, but a strange middle ground. How could one feel celebration while living in defeat? At one camp in Bavaria, the morning began like any other. Roll call. Sun rising over barbed wire. Dust kicked up by boots. Yet the guards looked different. Freshly shaved, uniforms neater, voices lighter. A small band near the gate rehearsed patriotic songs. The tune was unfamiliar, but the mood unmistakable. Soon the carts arrived, metal drums filled with ice, stacks of paper cups, and soldiers using scoopers instead of rifles. At first, the women hesitated, hands folded, eyes down. One German nurse whispered that it must be a trick, that Americans were testing loyalty. Another reminded her that the barracks had been searched the previous night. Suspicion remained the last shield of pride. A guard stepped forward, raising his voice only enough to be heard. Line up. Everyone receives one. No threats, no shouting, just routine, as though this were normal. The women shuffled forward. Guards counted carefully, ensuring equality. Each prisoner received the same scoop as the next, a consistency shocking to those who had seen the Reich ration by favoritism and fear. The first taste came slowly. Cold, sweet, shockingly soft. Some women gasped at the sensation, frozen cream pressing against teeth weakened by wartime hunger. Others stared into their cups, overwhelmed by the memory of cafes, birthdays, and family dinners. A few guarded tears slipped on his sunburned cheeks. Around them, American soldiers cheered each other's jokes, clapped shoulders, and raised flags with proud shouts of home. Yet there was no mockery, no humiliation. Their celebration did not demand the prisoners' joy, but neither did it exclude them from witnessing humanity. That boundary, that refusal to turn victory into cruelty, became the turning point. Women who had expected retribution now saw evidence that the enemy's victory did not require their torment. The Americans had not lost loved ones or cities on the scale Europe had, but they had sacrificed dearly and still chose compassion. The shift was not loud. No speeches, no announcements, just spoons clicking against paper cups. just the taste of sugar returning to a world that had forgotten sweetness. Later in the afternoon, loudspeakers carried President Truman's voice from a radio broadcast, speaking of the cost of war and the hope for peace. The words were foreign to many prisoners, but the tone was unmistakable, grief wrapped in resolve. Women listened, recognizing something that felt strange. Even the victorious felt sorrow. As evening approached, some camps allowed women to gather near the fences to watch fireworks igniting above distant American barracks. Bursts of color framed the sky over lands still scarred by artillery. The spectacle was not grand. A few rockets, simple flares, nothing like pre-war festivals. Yet for the prisoners, each spark illuminated a future where life might resume. One woman later wrote that the fireworks looked like flowers blooming in the darkness, a reminder that beauty could still grow where war had scorched the ground. When night settled, the guards resumed their positions. Keys locked gates. The fences remained. Freedom did not come with dessert, but something irreversible had begun. A fracture inside the psychological walls built by years of propaganda and fear. The next day, routines returned. Work details, inspections, long hours of waiting. But eyes met differently. Words felt less forced through interpreters. A guard might ask if the dessert had been to their liking. A small, awkward gesture that drew shy nods. The war had taught millions to dehumanize the enemy. Yet a single act, cold, sweet, and fleeting, reminded these women that the enemy could choose otherwise. In the news of July 4th, hospitality traveled fast. From one camp to another, whispered accounts spread. They gave us ice cream. They celebrated without us, but not against us. They treated us like people. This was the pivotal turn, when captivity ceased being pure fear and instead became the waiting room of an uncertain but possible future. The next transformation would be deeper still, because when simple kindness proved propaganda wrong, identity itself begins to change. The ice cream lasted minutes. Its meaning lasted months. As that July sun dipped below the fences, an unspoken understanding spread among the women. Fear no longer dictated every second of captivity. They were not being erased. They were being held and respected until the world outside could decide their fate. The shift did not come with banners or medals. It emerged through the smallest, almost overlooked encounters. A guard offering a second napkin. A medic pausing to explain a diagnosis. A chaplain asking if anyone desired a prayer in German or Italian. Women who once hid their faces behind hair now lifted their chins. Eye contact returned, cautious but real. Silence during roll call softened. Some even replied with clear voices when names were spoken. The atmosphere remained tense, but tension without terror is survivable. One American officer later recorded that he saw less trembling in their hands after that holiday. Trauma had not vanished, but trust had entered the camp like a quiet guest. News reached other facilities. In the Rhineland, a camp supervisor received a request from female prisoners. Do the Americans celebrate July 4th every summer? The question held hope. It asked indirectly, will there be more humanity? In Italy, at a camp near Florence, guards improvised when ice deliveries faltered. They crushed fruit into shaved ice and handed it out with the same ceremony. The reaction was identical: confusion, disbelief, then teary gratitude. Human beings had rediscovered what it felt like to be treated as such. Not all guards embraced this change. Some resented the idea of kindness toward people whose countries had inflicted terrible suffering. They carried personal losses, brothers killed in the Ardennes, ships sunk in the Atlantic. For them, The barbed wire was a barrier keeping hatred from spilling out. But military law stood firm. Discipline enforced compassion even when emotions resisted it. In the Pacific, the contrast was even sharper. News of the Bataan Death March and Japanese atrocities hardened American attitudes. Yet female prisoners of Japanese origin held by U.S. authorities, especially those on the mainland, still experienced moments of inclusion during American holidays. An internee in California wrote in her diary that the camp's July celebration made her feel like a visitor to a party, not a prisoner to an enemy. The irony was painful but important. A system that wrongfully imprisoned these women still allowed glimpses of freedom that dictatorships denied entirely. As autumn approached and repatriation planning intensified, relationships between guards and prisoners grew more personal, within boundaries tightly enforced by rules. Women asked about the families they hoped to return to. Guards responded with stories of farms in Iowa, schools in Ohio, and movie theaters in California. Dreams of home crossed the wire in both directions. Meanwhile, diaries filled with reflections born from that turning point. The Americans do not hate us. They believe in the law. Our suffering is not their goal. It did something profound. It reopened the idea of a future. Women planned quietly, not an escape, but a return to life. They wondered whether they could be nurses again, whether shattered cities could be rebuilt, whether children could grow up without bombs overhead. Psychologists would later call these moments micro-restorations of normalcy. A cup of ice cream might seem trivial, but to those who had known starvation and fear, pleasure felt revolutionary. Commanders observed the change with satisfaction. A calm prisoner is easier to manage. A hopeful prisoner is less likely to resist. Policy and morality, for once, aligned perfectly. By the winter of 1945, American POW camps had become waiting stations for transition rather than sites of dread. The fences still stood, symbols of accountability and unfinished war. But the emotional landscape inside had shifted irreversibly. The greatest turning point was not that the ice cream tasted good. It was that the gesture insisted. In a world where cities had burned, families vanished, and entire ideologies crumbled, that message mattered as much as any treaty. Because war can crush bodies and nations, but the smallest act of mercy can rescue the soul. The consequences of that shift, psychological, political, and deeply personal, would become fully visible as the war ended and the gates prepared to open. May 8th, 1945. Celebration erupted across Europe. The guns fell silent, flags rose, cities cried and cheered and mourned at once. But behind the fences where the women remained, nothing changed. Not yet. For the female prisoners in American custody, V-Day arrived like a distant sound carried on the wind. Victory outside did not unlock their gates inside. War crime screenings, repatriation logistics, transport shortages. The machinery of peace took time to begin. So the waiting continued. Days folded into weeks. Summer approached, then passed. But the mood was no longer one of dread. That small moment of humanity on July 4th had shifted the atmosphere. Instead of fearing their captors, many began to understand that they were being protected, not punished. American Red Cross officials visited frequently now, checking water systems, inspecting food quality, ordering warm blankets ahead of winter. Meals improved. Canned meat and beans replaced thin soups. Fresh fruit appeared. Medical care was consistent, not improvised. One U.S. officer wrote in a report, "These women must walk out stronger than when they arrived." It was more than a line. It was a directive. Victory would not be stained by retribution. Yet freedom could not be granted blindly. Every woman underwent a formal evaluation. Were they soldiers? Auxiliaries? Civilians swept up in uniforms as the Reich collapsed? Had they obeyed orders or enforced them? The overwhelming majority were ruled simply caught in a storm they never controlled. A clerk from Stuttgart was asked only one final question. What will you do when you return home? She answered live. That was enough. Some prisoners carried guilt for serving a regime they did not fully understand. But their examiners made something clear. Responsibility lived mainly with those who issued commands, not those who followed them to survive. As trains and trucks at last arrived to take them home, there was dignity in the process. Clothing was issued, food packed, medical records copied. The Americans even played jazz as the vehicles pulled away, a gentle soundtrack for people re-entering a world without gunfire. Freedom felt unreal. Women stared out the windows with joy and terror intertwined, afraid it could be taken away again. Some worried about what waited for them on the other side of the border, or who wouldn't. Many returned to ruins. Homes flattened, families scattered or buried, children missing. The war had taken far more from them than any prison camp ever could. Yet almost every one of them recalled the same truth. The Americans treated us like humans. Mercy became a seed inside them, fragile but alive. Over time, these women built new lives shaped not by war, but by the compassion they had received. They became teachers and nurses. They rebuilt neighborhoods. They raised children with a commitment that their generation's suffering would never repeat. One woman wrote years later, "They handed us ice cream. And in that moment, I realized the world could heal." The fences eventually opened for all. One step, then another, into sunlight that no longer belonged to soldiers. They walked away not as defeated enemies, but as survivors carrying a quiet message into the future. Humanity, even in small portions, can change the outcome of wars long after the guns fall silent. Years passed before many of the women could fully comprehend what had happened to them. Not only the war, but the moment they were shown kindness when they expected fear. Trauma does not disappear when fences open. Nightmares linger. Silence often speaks louder than memory. But those who carried the story of that July day held on to something that helped them rebuild. Proof that mercy can exist even in war. For some, the first year home was the hardest. Germany was divided, rationed, and under surveillance. Women who had worn even the simplest uniform were sometimes viewed with suspicion by their own neighbors. Some married fellow survivors. Others wandered from town to town until they found a relative still alive. Many refused to speak of the camp, but spoke often of the Americans. They remembered the small gestures. The guard who joked clumsily in broken German. The medic who brought aspirin without being asked. The officer who held a gate open just a little longer so a frightened woman could walk through at her own pace. And always, they remember the ice cream. Historians later came to see those gestures as more than goodwill. They were seeds of a new world, one in which former enemies would become allies. When the Cold War began and Germany was split by ideology, a generation of women raised their children with a quiet conviction that Americans could be trusted, not because of politics, but because of personal experience. Some of the women who had been prisoners went on to join civil programs funded by the United States during the rebuilding of West Germany. They worked in schools influenced by American education reforms. They helped run hospitals that received U.S. medical support. They guided communities toward democracy because they had once lived within the alternative and had escaped it with dignity intact. Psychologists studying their accounts years later noticed a pattern. Most survivors did not describe themselves as victims. They spoke of what they endured, yes, but more vividly, they recalled the moment they realized the enemy was not who they were told he was. They discovered that cruelty is a choice, not a rule of war. Humanity is one as well. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories not only of destruction, but of a day when soldiers celebrated their national freedom by giving ice cream to the very people they had been fighting. In a century scarred by brutality, such a detail seemed almost unbelievable, and that is why it was remembered. One former prisoner, writing late in life, summarized it simply. History told us we should hate each other. Reality served us kindness instead. She kept a postcard sent to her by a camp guard, a man who later wrote that the day he handed ice cream to the prisoners was the moment he realized the war had truly ended. He had fought long enough. Now, it was time to repair. What began in wooden barracks and barbed wire fences became part of something larger, a foundation for reconciliation. Enemies laid down their fear. Former captives carried forward the proof that compassion can cross any border, even one marked by war. The war had taken nearly everything from them, but it did not take their ability to recognize when the future opened its hand. And when they stepped into that future, they carried a quiet certainty that would help shape the peace to come. War often writes its lessons in ruins. It carves warnings into stone and memory, telling future generations what hatred can destroy. But sometimes, the most important lessons of war arrive not in battles won or borders redrawn, but in small acts that refuse to let humanity die. On July 4th, 1945, a handful of American soldiers chose to celebrate freedom by extending it in the simplest form, a sweet, cold moment of kindness handed to the very people their nation had fought against for years. There were no speeches, no banners, just ice cream melting on a summer afternoon and the quiet shock of women who thought they deserved only punishment. History rarely pauses to notice such gestures. They are too soft, too quiet, too human. And yet, this is precisely why they matter. For those women, the war did not end when the gunfire stopped. It ended when fear did. When the enemy revealed himself not as a conqueror, but as a fellow human being, tired, young, ready to return home just like them. That memory traveled far beyond the fences of a POW camp. It settled into families and future decades, shaping how one nation learned to trust another again. The seeds of the post-war alliance between America and Germany were planted not only in treaties and reconstruction funds, but in ordinary compassion, the kind that restores dignity one person at a time. This is the quiet aftermath of war. Lives rebuilt not by governments, but by gestures. Healing born from mercy. Peace sustained by understanding. The women who once stood in line behind barbed wire never forgot the day their captors showed them grace. They carried that truth into the world, reminding anyone who would listen that humanity can survive even the darkest years, if someone chooses to protect it. Perhaps that is the greatest victory any war can offer, discovering that compassion, once given, becomes impossible to silence.